Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Broadband Breakfast Club. My name is Sylvia Syracuse, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Events. And today we have a great program. It's the start of the 5th year of the Broadband Breakfast Club. And I'd like to thank the sponsors who've made the Broadband Breakfast Club possible. Comcast, Google, ICF International, National Cable and Telecommunications Association, NCTA, US Telecom, and the Telecommunications Industry Association, TIA. And I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, which is our founder and publisher, Drew Clark. Drew has a long-standing reputation for fairness and depth in his reporting. As a journalist, Drew worked for the National Journal Group for 8 years, and then as Telecom and Media Ownership Project of the Center for Public Integrity. He was also Assistant Director of the Information Economy Project at George Mason U. In addition to his work with Broadband Breakfast, Drew is also the Executive Director of the Partnership for Connected Illinois, the state broadband initiative entity based in Springfield, Illinois. Please join me in welcoming Drew.
Thanks to all of you for braving the storm out there, and we appreciate the great turnout and the wonderful panel that we have here with us. I'll go ahead and briefly introduce our panel. You have a program with everyone except for our center panelist, so I'll speak a bit more about him. First, on your left is Martha Dugan. She's the Senior Vice President for Regulatory Affairs at the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. And NRECA has been representing the rural electric co-ops before federal agencies on many issues, worker safety, emergency management, transportation, communications. And the NRECA, I believe, covers 75% of the land mass of the United States. So these people are out throughout the country, and they may not themselves provide broadband, although some of your members do, but they're very interested in ensuring broadband throughout the country. So I'm sure she'll be able to give us some perspective on the co-ops' perspective on broadband performance. Then next to her is David Young. David is the Vice President of Federal Regulatory Affairs at Verizon and deals with items before the Federal Communications Commission pertaining to broadband, internet, video, and emerging technologies. And he's been responsible for company policy on internet and technology issues in many forums, including 6 years at Verizon Research and Development. So we're really grateful David's with us. All right, in the center is Thomas Gideon. Thomas is the technical director of the Open Technology Institute, which is a project at the New America Foundation. And as technical director, he's responsible for managing and supporting technological and data-driven policy interventions, including the Commotion Mesh Wireless Networking Project, as well as Measurement Lab, which I'm sure we'll talk quite a bit about today, a network measurement research platform that has produced the largest cache of open broadband performance data on the planet. He also provides technical expertise to issues pertaining to security, privacy, copyright, and digital rights management. So we're really grateful that you could join us at the last minute and be on our panel. Next to him is Stephen Morris. Stephen is the Vice President and Associate General Counsel at National Cable and Telecommunications Association, and he deals with a lot of issues pertaining to regulation of telecom and broadband services. Prior to joining NCTA in 2006, he was the Deputy Chief of the Pricing Policy Division in the Wireless Competition Bureau of the FCC. And he's been dealing with a lot of inter-carrier compensation issues. Good luck with that. And other matters of concern for the cable and telecommunications industry. And then last but not least, we have Alan Friedman. Alan is the research director at the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. It's a relatively recent center, about 2 years old, I understand, that is focusing on a range of technology policy issues from electronic medical records to telecom policy. And he, previous to that, was a fellow at the Center for Research on Computation and Society at the Harvard Computer Science Department. And I believe you had an affiliation with the Berkman Institute as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was a fellow there.
Fellow at the Berkman Institute at Harvard Law School. So we're really grateful for. Didn't write that report. Okay, well, perhaps that will come up too. We'll see about that. So I wanted to, again, in thanking our panel, tee up the issue. There's in some respects a great wealth of broadband data and information now versus 4 or 5 years ago. It's almost startling when you think about the difference, because the 706 reports that the Federal Communications produces as a result of the 1996 Telecom Act calls for them to produce a report every year or so about broadband performance. And prior to the last several years, they were relying on data that was imputed or inferred from various data sets that were not available open and publicly. But in the latest 706 report that was released last month by the Federal Communications Commission, they have access to a wealth of data that comes from the state broadband initiative entities. Sylvia mentioned that I have the opportunity to be affiliated with one of those 56 state entities, and we collect data from providers throughout our respective states, and then that data rolls up into the National Broadband Map, which displays at a census block level where providers are or where they claim to be in the United States. With that data is also advertised speeds. So the advertised speeds is listed and available, and many of the state entities, including Broadband Illinois, publishes these on a state map as well as the national broadband map. But that's not all. There's also additional measurement sets. Besides those done by private industry and nonprofit groups, the Open Technology Institute and the Measurement Lab project collects data that's available. The FCC commissioned a series of measurement reports. It released the second of these reports in July, and in going through it, you see that they have been able to show progress in the benchmarking of carrier data. From the first report that they did in 2011, they found that 87% of internet service providers matched the performance that they advertised or promised. This past July report found that 96% of those providers that they benchmarked met those performance targets. Now, these were the 13 of the largest providers, many major cable and telecommunications company, not wireless companies. And I looked through the report just to get the cheat sheet version of the top 3 entities for download speed in meeting their targets were cable, Cablevision, Verizon's fiber service, and kind of a tie for third between Cox and Comcast. Cox had a better 24-hour average. Comcast was better on peak speeds. That's the download speed. On the upload speeds, in terms of the percentage of meeting their promised performance, Verizon DSL was tops, Mediacom was second, and Comcast was third. So, I mean, this is data that came from thousands of data points conducted by Sam Knows under contract from the Federal Communications Commission. And so this kind of data was simply not available in previous FCC reports. And so we do have a very different world, but what we're here to talk about is, well, what have we learned not only from these new data sources, but from the measurement of the data and what that's saying about the progress that the United States has been having in broadband progression. And I think it's probably fitting I turn to Verizon because you're one of these individual providers who has been measured and tracked, and I'm wondering if you could tell us anything about your experience or responses to these reports and analyses that the FCC and others have been conducting.
Great, thank you, Drew, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. We are actually very pleased with this program. We think that prior to the FCC's Measuring Broadband America program, there was a lot of misinformation out there, in part because it was not easy to collect and correlate data that would be necessary to come up with something more accurate. Let me give you an example. In the UK, much of the broadband is DSL based, and the way that it's sold there is just an up to speed. So the maximum speed that you could get on the DSL, I don't know if it's 20 megabits per second, let's say, that's how they advertise it. Of course, the actual speed that people can get depends on how far away they are from the central office, and as a result, the average speed that people would get would be somewhere in the middle between 0 and 20, let's say. So the UK did broadband tests and came up with results that showed that the average person in the UK was getting roughly half of what was the advertised speed. And that sort of became the popular belief that that was true of all broadband services. And that was what the FCC said actually in their National Broadband Plan report. They echoed some of those results, as well as some results produced by other similar tests. And the fundamental problem with a lot of this is that they really had no way, they could see what the average speeds that they were getting were, but they had no way of correlating that with what the customer had actually purchased. And that's what the FCC's test really does, is each of the volunteers, they know what service that customer has purchased, what speed they're supposed to be getting, and then what speeds are actually being generated. And it's done in a way that eliminates variability due to the type of computer they're using, or other applications that might be running, or other things that are going on in the house, to produce a real apples to apples comparison.
One thing I was disappointed by in looking over that report is I couldn't see a breakdown by geography of how good a Verizon fiber service is in Virginia versus New York, for example. Did you have access to greater data from the FCC, or obviously internal data that allows you to know, oh, we're really good in this area, or we're not so good in this area?
So just speaking for my company, because I can't speak for anybody else's, I don't have access to their data, but our service performance doesn't vary by geography. A FiOS 35 meg connection is 35 megabits, whether it's in New York City or Virginia or California or wherever. So the technology it delivers the same consistent speed regardless of where you're located. Mm-hmm. Similarly, we engineer our DSL services the same way, so that whatever your line is capable of delivering, that's what we'll offer to you regardless of where you live.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, what was your reaction to the FCC's Measuring Broadband report?
We've been, I think, overall pleased with we were certainly pleased with the results of the latest report, which we think confirmed that our companies are delivering the service they say they're going to deliver in their advertisements. As David pointed out, we disagreed with the Commission a few years ago when they said there was this huge gap between what companies are promising and what they're delivering. We thought they were misusing some of the data they had, and that the situation here was much better. I think both reports have shown that to be the case. For us, I think, certainly for me, coming at it from the legal regulatory perspective, one of the things that's been so interesting about this process is that it's really been a voluntary process. There's no Commission mandate that says, you have to do broadband testing. There's no statute that covers this. There's no rules that cover it, no Commission orders. It was an issue that came up in the broadband plan, and folks in industry and academics and public interest groups have sort of, even before the Commission convened a group, came together and started talking about how can we come up with a test that is going to accurately measure different kinds of companies and come up with some information that's meaningful to consumers. And it took a long time. The logistics of this are tricky, trying to figure out where we're measuring from and where we're measuring to, and how to do it in a way that is an accurate result for Verizon and for my companies, how to report that data, what goes in the FCC report, what's made available to the public. And I think the end result is one, because it's been a collaborative process that we've got a wide group of participants in. I think it's been a success. I think most people view it as a pretty successful project. I think a lot of the same things can be said about the mapping exercise. I mean, a little different because Congress directed that there NTIA make a map and appropriated a lot of money for it. But that's, again, a situation, there's no mandate on broadband providers to participate, but the vast majority have participated, have been very engaged with the state mapping entities, and the result has been something that I think works for everybody and has been very successful. I think the map is, that, as you said in the beginning, we just have so much more information than we did just a few years ago, and it's, we already see, the FCC using that in the universal service context, which is, we think a great thing. Now that we know where people have broadband and where they don't, we can start directing money to the places that still need it and not direct it to the places that already have broadband. So you already see tangible benefits, and that's a good thing.
So interesting dynamic. You're saying the self-regulatory, if you will, the voluntary efforts are the ones that are more successful than some of the earlier efforts that relied upon a mandate like the Form 477. What's your take on the future? Is this measuring broadband going to be repeated on an annual basis? Do you know, Stephen?
I mean, it's an interesting question because I think, the testing so far has been that 11, 12, 13 of the largest ISPs. I think there are questions about how you expand that, whether whether and how. I think it gets, you asked the question about how come we don't have more localized results.
Yeah.
Well, the reason is because you would need much bigger samples to do that, which adds cost because each of these panelists has a box that's been provided to them. Recruiting bigger panels is a bigger deal that costs more. To get a valid sample for a small company that has just a few thousand customers, figuring out how to do that is a little trickier. Figuring out where they should be testing to, and whether that's most of the bigger companies have networks that pass by at least one of the MLab test points that are being used. But when you get down to smaller companies, they don't, and they're buying transport to get to the big cities. And then you have a question of, well, are you counting that transport against that company's results, and how? So there's just a lot
It's
of
a comprehensiveness versus fairness issue. Well, that's a great segue to Thomas. There's so many questions we could ask you. Why don't you just start by telling us about what Measurement Lab and what OTI is, and how you've been involved in this issue?
Sure. So OTI is the technology program at the New America Foundation, and we work on a wide variety of issues that often are kind of hard to tie together and characterize. I like to think of them all as relating in some way to access to information or access to networks. And I think that if you think about it that way, a lot of the work that we do across policy, qualitative research, quantitative research like Measurement Lab, and technological interventions like Internet in a Suitcase, Commotion that you mentioned in my intro, all kind of fit into that broader sort of framing. We were a founding partner with Measurement Lab, formed to create a research platform similar to and continuous with, but unlike other research platforms that we'd seen thus far. So we're built on top of the Planet Lab stack and leverage their over a decade and a half operational experience with test beds like Planet Lab Central, operated out of Princeton, Planet Lab Europe, operated out of UPMC, INRIA, and others in Europe. But to provide, rather than sort of the short-term sort of experimentation and push towards publication of findings that most of those test beds are built to serve, to provide longitudinal testing and high-quality resources for measurement over time with an understanding that the internet evolves. I think that's one of the findings that we're interested in with this report more generally, seeing how networks change over time. I think that's well represented in the FCC report. The fact that we have 3 years worth of data and we're continuing to collect, to grow, and to expand globally means that we're in a unique position to look at that more longitudinally.
So what's the story of the data that NDT, that Measurement Lab's been collecting through the NDT platform, the network diagnostic tool of Internet 2 that Measurement Lab's using? What's the story that you're seeing from that versus the story that you're seeing from these FCC reports, if indeed there's a different
Well, I think David very tellingly pointed out the difference, that the FCC study is undertaken in a very particular way with a controlled sampling plan, with validation of panelists, and it's constituted to answer a very specific question that I think we've hit upon really well here in terms of how well do the providers actually live up to their commitments in terms of the service that they're offering. And I think that if that's the question you're seeking to answer, I think the program is put together well for that. And we're seeing interest from other regulators elsewhere, since MLab and OTI's work is international, and that same question. But MLab also hosts a broad spectrum of measurements, not just on broadband performance, but also on issues of traffic management, because that's a keen interest when you're talking about unfettered access to networks, to issues of free speech increasingly online, and even starting to get into looking at surveillance and censorship online as well. So this is just one thing that we look at, and I think in that context, the best thing I can offer is the fact that we emphasize we require open methodology, open source, and open data. It means that if you have questions about how the FCC study and results differ from NDT, and the FCC results also, we're very pleased with the FCC's commitment to open release of data and to openly work with us with their releasing their methodology and their source code as well. We can bring academics, we can bring technical experts in to answer those questions. It's kind of hard to reduce in a simple conversation, because they do measure, admittedly, very different things. NDT is not, first and foremost, a performance tool. It is what it says. It's a network diagnostic tool, so it measures quite a bit more than just throughput.
Do any of the three of you have a perspective on sort of the lingering differences in different speed tests? Like you test against Ookla, you get rather different results from testing against Measurement Lab. I don't know how the SAMNOS tool compares to those two, but what are your perspectives on differences and why we see those in those results?
I think, like I said in the beginning, it's really comes down to how the test works and what exactly it's testing. And so, and it's not only those sorts of tests, but also the results that are published by companies like Netflix and Akamai and whatnot. And to use my house as an example, I have a 75 meg Fios connection in my house. I've got a Wi-Fi connection, and my kids use it with their laptops or iPads and whatnot. And so, you know, if my daughter is watching Netflix on her iPad over the Wi-Fi while the other kids are, you know, doing Skype or, you know, YouTube or whatever, the performance that she's going to see from her iPad over that Wi-Fi connection to Netflix is not going to be representative of the 75 meg connection that's provisioned to the house. And so, you know, it produces an interesting and accurate measurement of the performance that she's experiencing at that moment in time. But, you know, you have to understand the context of it and you know, what you can infer from that.
Again, this is why the FCC study, our partnership with SAMNOS, is just one part of the work that we do. We also look at, we're onboarding an experiment out of Georgia Tech actually now, I think it's out of UMD, Project Bismarck, to do CPE-based testing for the exact same reasons that David spoke to so well. But we think that more inclusive measurement, looking at more dimensions, allows us to answer more questions. So if the line speed, the provisional line speed is the only question that you're focused in on, then sure, you know, one specifically crafted experiment for that makes sense. If you're also interested in how the average quality of experience perhaps affects meaningful broadband adoption, if you're looking at how people manage their technologies in the home, they make choices based on their actual experiences. We think having more data to speak to that is useful as well.
And that's one of the, I mean, you asked what's the future of this program. I think one of the questions for the FCC is there a role for the FCC in either more testing or just educational efforts in terms of performance of equipment in the home, performance of networks other than the last mile network? Those are all, I mean, I think those are things that are open for discussion, but certainly should be part. If you're looking at performance, there's a lot of things that affect it. The focus initially has been on wireline ISPs, but there's a lot, it's a lot bigger world.
Just 2 weeks ago, the FCC announced that they were going to begin a process of mobile testing. I believe there's a meeting this Friday to discuss this. Anyone have any perspective on that? Verizon?
Well, we will certainly be there, and we're eager to work with the FCC once again on this. The mobile environment is very different, and I think that the test is going to be very different than the wireline test that was set up. But we're interested in hearing from them what they have planned and working with them to make sure that whatever they do produces the best results possible in a way that fairly measures each company's performance and accurately reflects the results.
Martha, what does all this testing and measurement and reports mean for the rural constituents of your companies, your co-ops, I should say?
I guess what I would say is that it would be nice if we had a problem of advertised speed versus delivered speed. Our issue is much more basic. Our issue is when will we even get broadband service? Having said that, I will say that we're aware, and I've talked to several members about this, in areas where there is annexation or where the rural area abuts with a more populous area and there is broadband service in the more populous area. This, in our view, has created a situation where we really need to have address level reporting and much more ability to peel back the onion. And the reason for this is very practical and comes out of the real world. In Indiana and Michigan and Missouri, we're aware of situations where houses that are across the street from each other, one side of the street has broadband, the other side does not. Houses that go on sale that have broadband access sell faster, sell higher. And that creates an even deeper level of the digital divide in our world. So we're watching the reporting. We think it's very important as this industry grows, but our concerns are a little more basic.
How have your members used the broadband maps that state entities have produced to get at this problem? Have you looked at them and you go, well, this is showing broadband in both, but we know there's not broadband across the street?
Yeah, we've looked at the maps in depth, and where there are issues, we've tried to communicate sort of the inconsistency between what the map is showing and what our members on the ground experience is, and we continue to try and drive that message to policymakers.
Stephen, what's your perspective on kind of this defined detail level and questions about is this accurate at the street level versus the census block level?
I think given where we were, the fact that we have now a census block level map is pretty unbelievable. I think obviously in some cases, there's a census block shows is served if it's partially served. And so you get to the next level question, which is how can we figure out where in the census block there's service? And I think going back to when NTIA set this up, I think they settled on census blocks because that was sort of the right balancing point between something that would, on the one hand, be meaningful, but on the other hand, not be so burdensome for broadband providers to provide that it would that they would balk and not participate at all. I think now, now that we're a few years into it, I don't know. It maybe if states or NTIA re-ask the question, maybe companies would be more comfortable at that level. I know one concern expressed at the time was that if you had a real-time map that purported to show at the address level that the potential for there to be mistakes was increased, whereas at the census block level, I think I haven't heard concerns that that's not right, that there's nobody, that the map is showing places as served when nobody has service. But at the street level, it gets harder to make sure that it's 100% accurate. But you know, I think certainly it does, you know, it would be, and certainly in your case, it would be more useful to have a more granular, and we have to balance that against the, you know, logistics and the cost.
Respond to that, and we'll get to you in a
Sure,
second,
and
David.
I totally agree that we're a long way from where we were a few years ago, and I think that is just fabulous. I guess my point is, let's not stop. Let's keep peeling back the onion, and while at the same time balancing the issues of cost and potential for error. But I just believe, given the brains that focus on this issue, there's got to be a solution there.
So we're looking at sort of the final output, the final result of the map itself and what's displayed there. But I think part of the process was designed to deliberately to include the state mapping entities, which would be closer to the state and the local communities and the issues there, and would also perhaps have the ability to work with local groups to address either demand issues or to identify the holes and help to focus investment in those areas. And so, you know, I don't think we need to look to the map itself to solve all of these problems if the process is actually generating that sort of result. And Drew, you probably know better than any of us here whether in fact that's happening.
Well, sure. Thank you, David. It's true that the data is most useful when looked at a much smaller level, at a county level or a sub-county level, because you pull out the maps and they look kind of all monotone when you're looking at a high national state level, but when you look down, you start to see little pockets. You see, okay, there's green coverage for faster deployment in this city that gets to lighter green or yellow as you go out, and then you can start to assemble the assets, and you can have local teams on the ground, E-teams, what we call them at the Partnership for Connected Illinois, and they work with the providers and with economic development officials, and co-ops are a natural part of that. So that's a great point, David. Thanks for bringing that up. I mean, from the national perspective, wireless provisioning is the ultimate in a large area of service. I mean, as the FCC starts to get into mobile broadband testing, are you going to have more questions about that, or is that going to be more difficult to measure and assess? This is 4G coverage, this is not 4G coverage.
No, it's complicated, true, and so we all do our best to project that to our customers through our own maps and of course through the information that we provide to the mapping entities. But I think it's manageable.
Yeah.
We're at about 75% 4G coverage now, with an expectation to be at 100% of our existing wireless footprint by the middle of next year. And so, but right now, we're providing both of those 3G and 4G contours to the mapping entities.
Let's invite Alan Friedman to give your perspective. Obviously, the data is only useful as it helps to drive some goal of policy or action. What's your sense of how the FCC has measured and teed up issues for action?
Well, the good news is that even if you still look at international rankings, we are not first in broadband. We are certainly first in broadband data. So I think that's a ranking that we can be very proud of. I think this is a very strong set of data. And to David and Steve's point, this is a great example of sort of multi-stakeholder processes working and people sort of finding a common goal, not a universal solution for every policy problem, but a very effective one. And certainly better than OECD data. When you're sort of looking at a paper with OECD data, you sort of have to have a certain number of flags for different countries as you sort of say, well, okay, this authority has this kind of internal bias, and it's hard to work with those numbers. So, as Thomas was mentioning, the fact that it is open is going to be incredibly powerful. I think there are at least the whole panel on TPRC this year on sort of big data is now going to be part of doing telecom analysis. We're going to have to learn to use large data sets, and fortunately we've been making great progress in that dimension. This is something that competition economists are going to have to learn to do. beyond just the simple data. So as someone who likes data and creative ways of doing it, we're going to have to send a lot of people back to school to learn GIS and things like that. It's also a good chance to explore some of the alternatives. Using this, you can have the microdata, but you can also begin to throw some of these sort of national level data together and look at potential for alternatives such as mesh networks or things like that for other creative alternatives to find novel solutions to particularly on the mobile side. With this much data, we'll be able to show something, and the fact that it is open is really nice. A caution is we should make sure that these studies themselves are also completely open and transparent. This is one of those things that if you have this much data, you can show anything, and some people will show anything, so you have to be careful about that. I think one of the next steps, the real missing questions, is to revisit the adoption question. The availability side is there, but now we'll actually be able to dive deeper into the adoption question. And so I think there's someone from Q here. It'll be interesting to take some of their data, which I think is now, there's a lot of GIS data in the Q data set, and so we'll be able to sort of do some cross-correlation there. Just on the mobile side, moving forward, one of the advantages is we know a lot about how people use phones. I think if you're an undergrad at MIT, you can't avoid being given a free phone from the Media Lab because there's so many different studies there that want to track every single thing that you're doing in exchange for a free phone. So I'm not involved in the FCC process, but certainly as we develop that, understanding the way that people are using mobile devices and how that has evolved over the last even 3 years is going to be an important part of developing that methodology.
Well, 1 month after this measuring broadband report came out on August 21st, the FCC issued a second report, the 706 report, and there's been some criticism that it looked at the data and found really sour conclusions. At the same day, the International Bureau released a report. It found a 24% increase in investment over 2011. It found that DOCSIS 3.0 footprint had gone from 20% of the country to 82%, and that 4G LTE 67% of the 9 million subscriptions to LTE are in the United States, 5.6 million of those. So what do the five of you, our panelists, take from those statistics? Are we making progress in broadband investment and innovation and deployment and use, or are we getting more data but it's not showing progress?
I think we're making a lot of progress.
Mm-hmm.
I think certainly from a cable perspective, the DOCSIS numbers you just read, I mean, 80+% of Americans live in an area where DOCSIS 3 services are available. Those companies offer different tiers, but those, in almost all cases, it's at least 50 megabits. Most are 100. Some companies are now experimenting with 300. That's a huge improvement over just the last couple of years. In terms of comparisons with other countries, from the cable perspective, there's no other country that has cable infrastructure like we do. I think that actually creates some complexities when you try to look at some of the OECD or some other data. Our situation here is different than in most other countries. The typical scenario in other countries is you had a state-owned phone company that became the dominant broadband provider using DSL, and then because there was only one, there was usually some sort of unbundling or something, usually lots of heavily subsidized services. Our model has been different, and it's been different since the beginning of broadband, because our services have never been regulated that way. You've got DSL, you've got fiber, you've got world-leading 4G services, and satellite. So it's just doing the international comparisons is hard because our situation is different. But overall, we think, the progress is good. We're a little disappointed the Commission has set up a test where anything less than 100% is failing, but that's what they've done for their own reasons. And
Alan and then Martha.
I think this touches back on what David was saying, which is, a metric is only useful if you use it for a particular purpose. And I think you can have multiple things that are true at the same time, such as we are making progress. We do not have 100% connectivity. Other countries do have some better connectivity. So again, I'm very skeptical of quantitative international comparisons when you have an N of 10 and everything, and you're controlling for 20 different variables. But the one data set that I like is, and you can feel free to tell me the bad data set is the CDN data set from Akamai, which is sort of, given that someone has access to broadband or high-speed broadband, what are some of sort of the averages we get? And they show that, listen, everyone's making progress. The United States is making progress. We still lag. And then once you have those numbers, you dive back into, well, what are you trying to do? And what are your tools? And how revolutionary is the policy options that you're looking at?
So again, the sort of boots on the ground perspective, I think it's true. We have made progress. We're making progress. We have a ways to go. My members serve 43 million electricity consumers, many of whom have no broadband. Some of them have dial-up, and they're grateful for it. So I just would urge us not to leave behind a great swath of the United States, because I think we're only as strong as our weakest brothers. So we have a ways to go.
Just to follow up on that, do you have thoughts on mobile in terms of whether you'd like to see it as something that's being measured and counting towards broadband?
I think that would be an interesting set of data to look at. Probably not critical to what my members are interested in.
Let me just ask, though, about whether, and don't mean to use digital divide as a kind of a all-purpose bad thing, but if the country increasingly is seeing 25, 50, 100 megabit in its urban and suburban core, and the rural areas are lucky to get 3. I lived in a rural area, had no cable or telecom for the last 2 years, DSL or cable. I was lucky to get 1 to 1.5 through a wireless device. Okay, I moved to a city. Suddenly, I have access to a DOCSIS 3 cable plant that's offering service at 25 meg. I mean, it's a huge difference. Mm-hmm. The kinds of things you can do at 1, 1.5, 2 are very different from what you can do at 25. And so, we used to think of broadband, all-purpose, you can do things faster. But now we may have to start to think about, well, there's grade C and grade B and grade A level broadband service. What is that going to do for the way we perceive of broadband and broadband progress?
So that sort of raises the issue of how my members use broadband. And I think what we focused on here is sort of the retail provision of services to customers. We actually focused more on operational use of broadband. We use it for what we call our smart grid deployments and our smart meters. We use it to analyze and assess our systems on their moment-to-moment operations. And as you might imagine, to keep an electric system in balance 24 hours a day requires a very solid system to rely on to do that. So I think from the retail perspective, maybe an ABC kind of situation would be acceptable and would demonstrate more progress. But I think operationally, to operate an electric utility, we really need to be in the A level.
Gray A plus.
Yes.
Steve?
I think one thing to also remember, and the Commission did talk about this in its 706 report, is, we know what the problem is. There's no business case for deploying broadband in places that have very few people and huge areas. And one of the major ways to change that is through the Universal Service Fund, which is what the Commission has been working on for the last few years. They adopted a major reform last year. Certainly the intent of that is working with the map data is, let's figure out where the people are, where the places are that don't have broadband. Let's direct the money to those places so we can build broadband there. or make the, give subsidies to people so they can go out and build it. And that's, so, I mean, the commission is doing
Everyone's doing
things
what
in
they
that.
should be, and we just need to get there and
We-
do it.
Yeah, I mean, and, obviously, if the, part of it is how much money is being directed at the situation. The commission set a budget and kept the program at the same size as it was. There's been, in the Stimulus Act a few years ago, there was money that RUS and NTIA gave out that is, that construction is in progress. So that's, hopefully some of that has been directed to unserved areas and people are getting online because of that. As with a lot of problems, it's a resource question, and how much money are you going to put to the problem, and how are you going to distribute it in a way that's going to get the most bang for the buck, and that's what the FCC at least is trying to do.
Sure. And the stimulus money that the RUS, we partnered with RUS to make sure that those funds went to unserved areas, and that's been a great program, and many of our members are, as you say, in the process of construction and build-out thanks to that program.
Now, the RUS awardees, they have a little more time to complete their build-outs till 2015 versus the NTIA ones, which are due to be done next year. We like to invite the audience to come in with questions in our discussion. Sylvia has a wireless microphone, so feel free to raise your hands and we'll recognize you and get all of you in this discussion as well. While we're waiting on audience questions, I wanted to ask about the adoption question. That is to say, let's say we are seeing progress with this figure, 96% of broadband providers are meeting the speed goals. That actually is the same as the percentage that the FCC is saying have access to 4 megabit or above broadband in its 706 report. But I believe 69% is the latest percentage of Americans who subscribe to broadband services at home. That is, a 27-point differential. What is going to be done to bridge that gap? Is I assume going to be a key question on a lot of people's minds. David.
Yeah. So one of the challenges there is that you mentioned the 69% figure of all households, but if you look at PC households, the adoption rate is much higher. I think Pew just recently had some figures that put it around 90%. And so I think one of the challenges is not so much just the broadband piece, but the whole computer piece, the cost of the computer, the complexity perhaps. And so I suspect that there are segments in our society who are not going to go the PC route for connecting to broadband and rather are going to use a tablet or smartphone as their primary means of internet access. And so, we may see wireline broadband adoption level out at some number, maybe it's 75%, I don't know. But that doesn't mean that the other 25% aren't adopting broadband or using internet, because I suspect that many of them will be doing it through their mobile devices.
Let's see what others think about that perspective. Is that a good thing or a bad thing if this 25% doesn't have access to the kinds of tools you have with the PC? Alan?
This gets back to a fairly old debate on sort of the digital divide and what we are expecting to throw something out on sort of the mobile access approach. There are a couple of challenges with mobile platforms serving the sort of policy needs that we want of internet access. It's a more closed platform than the PC environment. There are much greater security issues, and they're going to be coming down the road even faster. We haven't quite solved the problem of mobile patch management on the Android platform. And I worry that a lot of the positive benefits that we might want are going to be harder to really push through in a pure mobile environment.
What about the question of price and the price of broadband service? Do you see price pressures to kind of segment the market, lower lower quality services at cheaper prices, at middle quality, at mid-price, premium, at premium prices? Are we going to see more of that, David and Stephen, in your lines of business?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a possibility. I think, it leads to, there's the issue of usage-based pricing comes up, and that's certainly a way to offer a sort of lower tier of service at a lower price, is to say, you don't get completely unlimited use. You get some fixed bucket of use.
Indeed, that's the default for wireless now, is 2 gigs or 4 gigs of download a month,
Right.
and then you hit your cap and do a couple movies and you go over that.
And I think what you see is companies thinking about these things, starting to think about how to experiment with that, trying to read the tea leaves as to what the reaction will be. There's a lot of, I think people are trying to figure it out, because there are millions of people who could be buying and aren't. And I think, for our companies and for David's company, we want more people to buy the service. We want to find ways to get people to buy it. That's what we do. And so, there's a lot of experimenting around that. Price is part of it, but as others said, I mean, for people who are not computer literate, there are a lot of people who just don't see how they fit into the internet world. For people who are, a chunk of those is older people who just don't think it's their thing, and with educate, I think, could be anybody's thing, but some people it's going to take some education, and some people, just don't seem interested. So it's getting the people who aren't on board yet. It's going to take a lot more work, and that's so it's slower, but everyone's still. I think there's a lot of thought going into it from the companies and the government, nonprofits. I mean, I think a lot of people are thinking about. Everyone recognizes how important it is to get as many people as possible online. So you see a lot of activity and effort, and hopefully that will pay off over time.
But the Pew surveys show that, for the majority of the non-adopters, the price of the broadband connection is not the primary reason why they don't have broadband. There are other reasons, like they don't see the relevance, it's too hard, they don't have a computer, those sorts of issues way much higher in the answers they give.
Are you seeing more new subscribers adopting broadband on a wireless platform or on a wired platform through programs that help kind of teach on use of computer, David?
Well, I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking.
Do you see, you discussed how we may see a leveling off of the percentage of wired broadband.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do about the other 25%?
Right, okay.
How do we get effective applications that,
Yeah,
you've seen that already?
Yeah, I think we are, and I think, again, part of it is going to be driven by consumer preference. So a consumer whose preference is to use a mobile platform in spite of, whatever limitations it may have, that may wind up being their driver for broadband in the home, because they like using their iPad or their smartphone, but they want to watch more videos, and they don't want to pay the mobile rate for that. So they say, hey, I'll get a broadband connection and a Wi-Fi router in my house, and now I don't pay for any of that usage. Well, I don't think we're seeing a lot of that yet, but using broadband as sort of just the anchor for the Wi-Fi in your home may be sort of how you reach that next 25%.
Did you have something to add, Alan?
I think there probably was a period where bundling broadband with other services increased uptake, but that's been going on for long enough that I don't think we're going to get more adoption from that.
I mean, that's what we were talking about was bundling, and that has been sort of for the last few years, the main strategy that companies have used to attract customers. But I think what we're now seeing is more people experimenting in the other direction. Instead of a bundle, here's our broadband only service, and that's really becoming the primary service for cable companies and phone companies. At least for some segment of the market, it's the broadband service that is the one customers are focused on and the one that drives them, and the phone and the video are secondary considerations.
We have a question from our audience.
Thanks, Drew. By introduction, I'm Kerry Hinton. I'm policy advisor to the chairman of the DC Public Service Commission, which, in full disclosure, we're a subcontractor to the DC office of the chief technology officer, who has the lead in preparing the broadband data submission to NTIA pursuant to the state broadband grants. And my question is that, and to start with a preface, is that in a week and a half we'll begin a new federal fiscal year, which means that it will be the last 2 years of federal funding to the states for data collection and preparation of state broadband maps, as well as other activities associated with that. Is there a long-term need, meaning in DC beyond 2 years, for a national broadband map, for state broadband maps? And secondly, if there is, who should collect the data and who should pay for the collection of the data?
Great question. Anyone want to take it?
It is a great question. I mean, I don't think we have an answer, certainly, that I'd give you at this point, but it's certainly something that we should all be talking about. And it's an issue that we all knew was coming, right? The initial grant of money was for 5 years, I think. And now is the right time to start talking about, do we continue? If we continue, in what form, and who's responsible for what's worked, what hasn't? Those are all really good questions.
I think they're great questions. I don't have an answer either, but I do want to thank you and Chairman Kane for her leadership in telecommunications issues in the states through the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. She's been very involved in these issues and is a great thought leader, so please give her my regards and thank her.
I mean, my own reaction to the question is I think it's incumbent upon state broadband initiative entities to find the case studies that show how it has helped advance broadband adoption, for example, how it has helped in the deployment of broadband in areas that you can look at the map and see, we need some investment here, let's go to the providers in this county and see with the economic development and the co-ops. And these are things that we're certainly doing in Illinois, the Partnership for Connect Illinois is doing, and I know Kerry and your colleagues are doing it. Jason Weddett was on our panel in July. He spoke about things that Massachusetts is doing. So, I mean, I guess maybe that's one thought behind how do you see the broadband map helping or hurting, if it hurts, in the deployment of broadband cases that your businesses serve? Or Thomas, do you have any perspective on that? How have you looked at the national broadband map and the data sets vis-a-vis what you're collecting at Measurement Lab?
I think it goes back to the point I made earlier about what questions you're trying to answer, what kind of occurs to me when we talk about the state broadband mapping initiatives, or even these questions of adoption we started digging into, is there's the role that service provision plays and availability and cost play, but I think there's also an experiential and knowledge gap. And so I think that's only ever going to be, the maps are only ever going to be a part of the picture. We need the kind of qualitative analysis that some of my colleagues at OTI also do in terms of understanding some of the questions that kind of David touched on and others touched on in terms of, is it too complex? Is that really the barrier as opposed to cost? So I think that's a challenge as well, to make sure that we're engaging not just in the pure quantitative reach of this data, but also looking at those experiences on the ground and how that affects the communities that still have not adopted, and why that might not be so.
Okay.
Just quickly, as a researcher, nothing's more annoying when you've got a great data set and then Congress defunds it. But the value of longitudinal data is only there if there's substantial change in the periods that you're measuring. We now have sort of they're scheduled for 4 full panels, and I don't, I am not deep enough in the data to know whether there's a large enough change from year to year to say, listen, we need this ongoing, or will this snapshot be good enough to address the policy priorities? But that's really what I would focus on, is just look at how much difference is there have we seen over time, and if the changes haven't been that drastic, then I think future initiatives can just be driven by that static snapshot.
Question?
Hi, this is Matthew Schwartz. I'm with Communications Daily. Last month I spoke to a couple of you and learned that there was, at the time, some tension regarding the FCC's introduction of formalized principles for open measurement, and about the fact that NLAB had started filing its own ex parte filings to document what had happened at the meetings. And I was wondering what the current state of trust is in the group and collegiality, and how strong the partnership is going forward, and what's the state of the open principles discussion.
Yeah, so I'll take that one. I think it's pretty good, actually. I think that, like any group of people, you go through periods of disagreement and tension and whatnot, but I feel comfortable that we've worked through it and we've returned to a level of trust that allows us to achieve the common objectives.
I can't disagree with that. But I won't say tomorrow that I might reserve the right to disagree. And I think David's right in terms of I would put it on a broader footing. We've been at this. We have 2 reports out. We've been heads down for the measurement study for the month of September. That's already in flight, and we're all really just focused on getting a good high quality collection on that, leveraging all of the experiences, good, bad, otherwise largely constructive, about how to go about this to inform continuing to improve on this. And I'd rather focus on that continual improvement regardless of where we may not see the eye to eye. And I think honestly some of those frictions actually result in a large part of the value of the exercise as well, kind of finding those outlying questions that are of interest to all of us that we might not have considered otherwise.
Great. I saw some other hands. We have a question up here.
Hi, I'm Ann Beigel with U.S. Telecom, and I had a question for Martha. I wanted to understand more about the difficulty that you were describing with the broadband access. Was that specifically customers that have smart meters, or are the cooperatives themselves lacking broadband?
The answer is yes, but I was focused on the co-ops themselves as business entities that can't get access to broadband in order to fulfill their operational needs.
So what are they running on a lot of it?
Band-aids and baling wire.
And how many would be in that situation?
It runs the gamut in terms of what they have access to and what they're using and what they're deploying, so it's hard to say a specific number.
Do co-ops resort to, in some cases, transmitting meter data wirelessly, and in other cases through smart grid improvements?
I'm not aware of any that transmit meter data wirelessly from the customer's home, but there probably are some out there that do.
Other questions? I thought I might have seen a few hands. I wanted to go to the point you were discussing, Thomas, and this discussion of the purpose for which you're collecting data, right? Mm-hmm. And we started today by talking about the FCC's measurement reports and comparing providers against their advertised speeds, and getting a result that shows a percent measurement towards that. What would you regard as the goals of the MLab measurement efforts? Do you do something similar, or do you do something different in terms of what you're trying to get at in the data collected?
Well, we do something similar in as far as we participate and collaborate with national regulators like the FCC, and not exclusively the FCC. So we're interested in the questions that they're interested in, and many of the questions that have been brought forward here in this discussion. But I think, really, for me, what's telling us that the questions themselves even tend to evolve over time, let alone the state of what it is that we're measuring. This is a vast and very dynamic system. So for us, the challenge is bringing in scientific rigor, transparency, and openness at an internet scale to answer whatever questions either we bring kind of predisposed to look at, whether those are ones of quality of experience, meaningful adoption, just connectivity, quality of service in terms of the provisioning context, or things that start to emerge out of that about even the fundamental architecture of the internet. So we do have a fairly deep pedigree and involvement with the research community in this space. And so there's a lot of things that we look to serve in terms of how they want to understand whether these technologies, these decades-old technologies in some instances, are still serving at the scales that are increasingly being deployed at, and where it makes sense to evolve those. So we've been very much on top of the IPv6 adoption. We're looking forward to working with the FCC, with others, with research bodies and other researchers to look at just some of the early metrics and gleanings we can get from that question about how that in practice is rolled out versus kind of what we want. If we had a magic wand to make IPv6 so, and then down the road, having good longitudinal data and comparative data in terms of how V6 actually, again, works in practice in the home, in the businesses, and areas of interest, versus how all of this data that we have about V4, how it stacks up. Does it live up to those promises, and then how that might inform what comes next?
Are you attempting to measure network management as well? Is that available through the tests that you're conducting?
Yeah, we do have some experiments that look at that. That's a very broad question. I think that starts to speak to where we are kind of resource constrained as much as we do brag about having an internet scale platform. There are only so many researchers and so many operational resources to undertake all of these interesting questions. But yes, we have been looking at partners at Georgia Tech running the Shaper Probe experiment. Had a very well-received paper last spring around certain forms of traffic management, in particular in the cable industry, really kind of bolstering, I think, the received wisdom about how it's being used. And then even some follow-on work separately out of MIT around speed boost and power boost as offerings, how that works, what's kind of the relative impact. So it's questions that we're increasingly grappling with more so. We have new experiments coming online all the time. This is definitely one of the areas that we're looking into more and more.
Okay. Are there other questions from our audience? Why don't we go ahead and give each panelist an opportunity to offer some concluding thoughts about the overall state, just sort of reviewing. We've been over how there's been a much greater availability of broadband data now, and how we've moved to two voluntary efforts, the state broadband mapping effort, as well as the Measuring Broadband America that the FCC did. And then, of course, that leads to conclusions, and there's sort of an open question about how the U.S. stacks up and whether our data is commensurable with other countries. But the sense of many of you is that we are seeing progress. Let's start with you, Alan. Is there any concluding thoughts you'd have about some of the open questions that need to be resolved to be able to come back in another year's time and say, okay, we've made this much more progress in broadband, we've got at the issues that are still unresolved right now?
And one thing, we were talking about this earlier, is might be a good time to sort of revisit some of the earlier metrics and models to see, okay, this is what we were estimating. Now that we have some more precise data, how accurate were these sort of sampling models? I think that would be very useful sort of planning forward, and also help with international comparisons of getting some pictures from other people. Are we continuously on a continuous trajectory from these earlier estimates, or is there wild discontinuities on different dimensions? And as much as I hate to sort of sound this vapid, it's a good time to sort of revisit what are the ultimate goals of widespread adoption, universal connectivity, things like this, and having that be sort of a strong motivator behind these reports as we have developed better and more precise metrics. Now sort of the question of, okay, let's start using them to answer the big questions that matter. What are we trying to do here?
Thank you. Steve, any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last thing that Alan just said is right. I mean, it's all about how do we take the data we get and use it to achieve the policies that we're trying to achieve. And I think, the map in particular, I think we're sort of just starting to do that, but I think there's a lot of good that can come out of that, and identifying the areas that don't have service, and then focusing on adoption issues, which are really big and complicated. And I think it's just a question of continuing to plow forward and make progress. I think the other thing is, I think we now have two really good examples of multi-party voluntary efforts that have worked pretty well. That's not a solution to every problem, but I think with this kind of track record, it's something we should, when the next problem comes up, we should be thinking about, is this a model we could use again? Because I think I think we've all been sort of pleasantly surprised that it's worked as well as it has.
Please, Thomas.
I'll agree with what Alan and Steve already offered and expand on it in terms of MLab has always looked not just necessarily at the formation of policy, but also informing consumers. And I think that there are not inconsiderable challenges in how we start to make the data understandable, craft narrative and presentation that maybe address more than one question at a time. So again, some of which we've kind of touched on today, and I'm looking forward to, in the vein of Steve's comments, how we leverage our experiences to date in that, as well as just the different approaches that we take and the different questions we undertake to answer.
I think that all of the data shows pretty clearly that the state of broadband America is actually pretty good and getting better. I think just the year-over-year improvement in results that the FCC's 706 report showed, with 26 million last year not having access and 19 million this year, a 27% reduction is a pretty significant improvement year-over-year. The SAMNO's studies show that broadband providers are delivering the speeds that they advertised, and those speeds continue to increase over time. So, I think going forward, we're interested in seeing a more holistic look at the broadband market, one that includes 4G wireless and satellite broadband, and the whole array of services that are available to consumers, because they're all relevant options.
We've made significant progress. That's a good thing. We need to make more, so let's not stop.
Well, before we conclude, Sylvia will make an announcement about our upcoming event.
Thank you all, and thank you all for coming. I want to thank again our sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast Club, Comcast, Google, ICF International, National Cable and Telecommunications Association, Telecommunications Industry Association, and U.S. Telecom. And I want to also point out our next event, which is on October 16th. It's going to be on the International Telecommunications Union yearly meeting and the Global Open Internet. So hope to see you all there. Thank you very much for coming.